Okay, so I'm just starting with this new training setup or this new training cycle. And yesterday we went to the gym together and I had my first workout, and it will have a specific sequence to it. And this is kind of what is going to be the basis of the program that we will be putting out. So maybe just let's talk this through kind of briefly and just generally. So the first thing that maybe we should talk about is that I just took 2 weeks off of the gym. So it was kind of handy because I was on vacation, and that was the first week of my deconditioning phase, and then there was another week that I did after that where I did no training whatsoever. So can we talk about that a little bit? What's the rationale behind that, and why is that important?
Well, the rationale is simply that as you are training, there's something called a repeated bout effect, where part of the adaptation process is not only building muscle, but it's also protecting itself from the actual strain on the tissue, the muscle tissue. And so part of what causes muscle growth to stagnate is that this repeated bout effect at some point becomes, like all the growth processes tend to slow down and even stop at some point, even if you add volume. And I mean, there's different studies showing that adding some type of novel stimulus can sort of restart things, but at a certain point, things are just going to slow down to a halt. And so what has been shown in a lot of studies now, and even one recent Norwegian study, is that taking some time off, that's like right in the sweet spot. We tend to use this terminology, sweet spot, a lot. That is long enough for these protective adaptations to dissipate. They don't go away completely. You can't reverse 20 years of training with a 2-week rest period, obviously, like those protective adaptations. But not so long that you start to lose muscle size. So the sweet spot tends to be around the 10 to 14 day point, going by experience and what research is available. So at that point, the muscle will initially respond almost like an untrained muscle. So you will almost be like a newbie, but except you have the strength level and the muscle mass of someone that's at your current level of development. So that's sort of instead of just hammering on with the heavy loading and increasing the volumes or introducing drop sets and whatever advanced techniques, at some point it's probably better just to take some time off, just to sort of reset everything and enable you to respond to light loads again. And looking at the research we have comparing high loads and low loads training, the most effective studies where you actually see that excuse me, where you actually see that high loads and low loads are equally effective tend to be in untrained or people that have rested for a certain period of time. Whereas studies using trained lifters, where they have some training experience and are still training, then you tend to see that heavier loads are more effective than lighter loads. So going back to what we have talked about in previous Q&As and before, you need to consider the condition of the tissue at the time you apply the load. So just taking a period of rest effectively resensitizes that muscle to load.
Cool. So speaking of light loads and heavy loads, so the first training day that we had yesterday, that was my first one after 2 weeks, and that seemed very, very easy. And basically we just did 1 or 2 sets, sometimes only one with high reps. And what is the purpose behind that? What is this going to mean for the rest of the program, and how is this should change, how this should change as we go forward? Because someone would start something like this, they would think that there is no way that this can work, because it just seems way too easy compared to what you normally would want to get out of a typical training routine.
Well, yeah, again, going back to the studies that have actually shown that 30% of 1 rep max, and even 20% if you add occlusion, blood flow restriction training, has been shown to be equally effective as 80% loads. So coming from that deload or deconditioning period, these loads will be even more effective, or actually they will be effective due to actually deconditioning the muscle. Also, you're doing more reps simply because the loads are lighter, but doing those reps and maybe even slowing down the rep tempo and avoiding locking out and just keeping constant tension on the muscle and all that stuff, to kind of seek out the burn, just tends to activate the metabolic stress pathway, which is both a separate but also an additive growth pathway. And again, since the tissue is deconditioned, it only requires like one light load set, and even two if you just, the burn is so uncomfortable that you're actually stopping 10 reps before failure. Then you will sort of feel whether you can do another set or not. At this point, we're not introducing MyReps yet, because that's sort of a very that's a training method that sort of maximizes the metabolic stimulus and also introduces a larger sort of perturbation, like a change in the internal environment of the muscle. So we're kind of waiting to introduce that until you have started to sort of accumulate some protective effect of training. So a lot of people will most likely feel a little sore after just doing that one set. I know I did. Depending on how close to failure you train. Now, you don't need to go to absolute failure, simply because that will just make it a little harder for you to recover throughout the training cycle. So I would prefer to have like cycles of some workouts being easier and training more sub-max. And as we get more adapted and also as we get into heavier loading, then you can add volume and proximity to failure. So yeah, those first few workouts are going to feel very light and easy. But there's definite value in it, and at this point you don't actually need more volume. Like since the tissue is so responsive to training, doing more sets than just that single set will most likely be too much, and the body will need time to repair that muscle damage before you're actually building muscle. So at this point, you actually need to restrict and limit yourself in order to not induce so much muscle damage that it's going to require more recovery time for muscle growth to happen.
Right. So the fact that I'm not feeling particularly sore after this workout yesterday, like I feel sore in my back, but not really in the chest or biceps, that's not a bad sign then?
No, not at all. I mean, we shouldn't be seeking out muscle damage, and I tend to think that if you are sore, then that's sort of an indicator that you could have done even less, because the soreness is that's inflammation in the connective tissue and the muscle, and that inflammation and swelling needs to subside before you can actually get into the real muscle growth sort of mode. So you shouldn't be excessively sore. Then you might consider taking it a little more easy on the next workout for that particular muscle group. But that soreness doesn't really tell us much of anything. It's not a good indicator for anything, and it's not like a good proxy for the effectiveness or muscle damage even. It's just an indicator that you probably have some muscle damage there, and again, it just shows that just a single set close to failure or sub-max set is sufficient at this point to induce that state.
Cool. So my reps are not introduced yet. So as the weeks progress now, so we just did like one set or two sets when it was like really too easy. So how should this change as the weeks come? Like, what will be basically the general focus? Like, what is the goal as the weeks progress? What are the? Come on, for real? Okay, whatever. Do we have a cock in the rooster? Cock? What is the name of this? That's making the
rooster, yeah.
That sound. But yeah, it's part of.
Better to have a cock in the pants than a cock in the garden.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the charm of the video. So what are the primary things that should change as the weeks progress? And so we will like decrease reps a little bit, increase load. Like, what are the primary things that should change as the training phase progresses?
The reps will decrease by function of the load increasing. And there's going to be like a regular loading increase from week to week and even workout to workout of the same exercises. The MyReps protocol will be introduced during the second week of the actual training, just simply because at that point the soreness from the first week is subsiding and the muscle is both getting into a growth mode and also accumulating the protective effects from training. So at this point you can increase the volume concurrently with the load increase, just to sort of maintain the stimulus that the muscle is actually adapting to a proper stimulus. Now, just going to failure or really close to failure all the time, and even my reps on their own have a very, they can be very exhausting for some people. And if you're doing my reps on a certain muscle group 3 times per week in some of the programs or some of the suggested splits, then some people will actually have recovery issues from that. So I would suggest having like 2 to 3 submaximal workouts where you have more reps in reserve, and then on sort of the third or fourth workout, you would, or whenever you feel like it, you would just be going closer to failure. But I would usually recommend intentionally having more reps in reserve on some workouts. Now, for those of you who have trained with my reps, you also know that if you train with more reps in reserve, train more submaximally, you can also do higher volumes. So this is the beauty of the auto-regulation aspect. So for instance, if you just pushed yourself to an absolute grinding max failure set and you manage to get 15 reps on the activation set, then you might be able to only get 3 reps and 2 reps on the subsequent sets. But if you held back and did it sort of submaximally and maybe you ended up doing 12 or 13 reps at that load, then you might be able to get like 4, 4, 4, 4 or something. So you can see while doing the program that volume tends to go up within this auto-regulation concept if you train more submaximally, but volume tends to go down if you train closer to failure. And this is also what we know will work very well. Training closer to failure will limit the volume you can recover from, and by using my reps, it will automatically happen.
Cool. So what would you recommend for me, for example, in terms of frequency? So I'm probably like an intermediate, like late stage intermediate, like in some aspects probably advanced. Like if you just look at strength standards on EXRX or something like that, then I'm advanced on some lifts. On other lifts, I'm kind of intermediate. So for someone like me, what would be the frequency that you would recommend? Because like we talked about maybe having like a tier when you could do full body training 3 times a week or even 4 times a week if you're advanced. So like what would your suggestion be for someone like myself?
Yeah, I'll probably start out doing 3, even up to 4 workouts per week during the light load phase, simply because now going by the occlusion studies again, where they're using light loads, they have these super high frequencies and see a pretty dramatic growth response from a super high frequency and volume for that matter. So doing like both like higher volume through added frequency during that part of the cycle is fine. But you will be increasing the loads very regularly. So at some point, you're going to get into the heavier loading. And at that point, I think it's better that you switch into lower frequency templates. So the suggestion would be as you switch, like there will be like a sudden switch, like a different phase of the program as you get closer to your 10 RMs. And move down move up into the loads that correspond to your 8 to 9 rep maxes. Now, this is the loading range where we see muscle activation being really high from the very first rep. So at this point, you don't really need my reps anymore. And as you get deeper into this heavy training, it's going to induce more muscle damage at a given volume as well. So at this point, I think I would recommend that you lower frequency, and that's going to be part of the template where you will sort of go from 3 to 4 full body sessions a week, and then introduce splits like an upper-lower split, training 3 to 4 workouts per week, which will be like a frequency of 1.5 to 2 times per muscle group per week.
Cool. So speaking of me, because I'm the center of attention here. So
what would be your recommendation?
Yeah, exactly. So what was I going to ask? Yeah, so what do you think is the goal that I should have in mind now? So being like a late stage intermediate, I'm probably not going to wake up looking like whatever Ronnie Coleman one day or Jeff Nippard or whoever. But probably I can still focus on getting bigger overall and like getting some size. So we just talked about before this video that the year before this one, I've gained probably a good 5 kilos of muscle, which is a lot of muscle. So like that's whatever, like 11 pounds or something. This past year, I probably gained like 2 kilos of muscle, which is about 5 pounds. I didn't train perfectly, but I trained pretty well for the most part. And so probably that means that I'm sort of closing in on my genetic limits slowly, which is kind of sad because obviously I'm not as huge as I dreamt to be one day when I started lifting a few years ago. But still, like, what do you think I should be focusing on in terms of muscle building and maybe nutrition for this upcoming year?
Well, I think using the nutritional templates and the guidelines that we provide with the system, you will sort of just naturally gravitate towards a higher muscle mass, and you could most likely also lower your body fat percentage. I would say that's highly likely. So your body composition is just slowly going to improve, and I wouldn't say you actually need to consciously focus on bulking in that regard. So this is going to be, again, a central part of the sustainable way, that you don't actually have that cut or bulk mindset, like I need to restrict or I need to overfeed or force feed. This is basically just going to happen naturally as you, it's from, instead of calculating all the calories you need and the macros and set things up with a surplus on certain days and deficits on certain days, or phases for that matter, you're just going to create an environment that's conducive to muscle growth. And by employing the principles that we will teach you, the body will demand calories, and you can probably confirm that you are more hungry today simply because you had the workout yesterday.
Definitely.
So I tend to say that train in such a way that you make yourself hungry, and you will automatically and spontaneously eat more to support that muscle growth. And during certain days and phases, you will maybe notice that you're not as hungry, and you will spontaneously eat less and perhaps end up leaning out slightly. So it's just going to be like a natural cycle that follows your physiological cues and what you're exposing your body to in terms of stress and adaptation demands.
Cool. So just a question on exercise selection. So these workouts, which are going to be in these templates, are going to be fairly short and not a whole lot of movements typically. But how much leeway can people get if they want to incorporate some of their favorite movements? So maybe we will recommend a couple of major pulling and pushing movements, but someone wants to train their traps or whatever. I want to incorporate some ab training, for example, or maybe someone is really concerned that they want to really emphasize the upper pec or something like that. How much leeway can people get with that kind of stuff?
Well, first of all, if you're smart with your exercise selection, then you don't actually need to add a bunch of isolation work to those parts of the body. But having said that, there's obviously going to be leeway for adding isolation exercises to your guns and your calves. But once you start getting into doing forearm flexor and extensor work and tibialis work and glute medius work and hip abduction and adduction and whatever else you can think of, is quickly getting into that Martin Burkhan fuckarounditis territory. So there's you use some common sense there, and I'm fine with just adding isolation work, especially during the lighter load phases where it's just high reps and manageable loading, and you generally just have more recovery capacity during that phase to add that isolation work. But as you switch and go into the low rep phases and the heavy loading, then I would strongly suggest that you just skip all of that isolation exercise stuff and just focus on the big compound movements to sort of, because doing those exercises will already maximize the development you can get in pretty much all affected muscle groups anyway. So there's no need to keep doing all of that isolation stuff. You sort of just perhaps benefited slightly from some added volume to specific body parts that you want to do, like the beach work type of thing, or the added hip thrust or glute bridges for the girls or whatever. But again, as you get into the heavier phases, I would just strongly suggest you're very simplistic and minimalistic in your exercise choices.
Gotcha. And final question that just popped into my head is, because it has this phasic structure, and you do the deconditioning phase, and then you start very light and then increase the load gradually. What happens if, say, someone starts out with the light phase, and then after let's say 2 weeks, they have to, they get sick and they can't train, or they have to go on, some kind of a travel engagement or something like that, and they can get their workouts in for a week. Where should we start after that phase? Go back to the previous phase, or just keep going where you left off, or what do you do?
Well, that's kind of up to you, but I mean, if you took 2 weeks off, you're basically deconditioned again, and you can enjoy getting muscle growth out of the lower volume. So I think at that point you should just restart the cycle.
1 week.
Well, if it's 1 week of rest, then you're sort of, you have 1 week of deconditioning. So what you could do is just go back 1 week of that training cycle where you left off. So just sort of, the same way that some programs emphasize, if you get sick or whatever happens and you have to take some unplanned time off, just back cycle the loads and go from there and start from there. Make the first couple of workouts slightly lighter and easier, and then almost pick up where you left off, minus 1 week, basically.
Cool. Yeah, well, I think I asked all the questions I wanted. So so this was basically the first video of this upcoming training cycle documentation. And I guess I will keep you guys updated about how it goes. And as the weeks progress and I will get into the subsequent phases of this training, I will keep doing these little videos alone at that point. But at least now we all had a good opportunity to pick the brain of the man himself. So thanks for taking the time to do this. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this episode. And once again, if you haven't checked it out already, be sure to visit the Sustainable Self-Development Facebook group at facebook.com/sustainable self-development. And if you haven't done it already, visit sustainableselfdevelopment.com to be up to date with everything that we've got going on there. All right, thank you for hanging on up until now, and see you in the next episode.